this conversation on, okay, got it. Yeah, welcome everyone to Designing Change, a panel that's part reflection on Tobias Wong's legacy and part dialogue on the social agency of design today. My name is Vivienne Gosselin. I'm the Director of Collections and Exhibition at Museum of Vancouver, or MOV. I had the pleasure and honor to curate the exhibition All We Want Is More, the Tobias Wong Project. It is a feature exhibition that opened at the Museum of Vancouver last November, and it's still on view until July 23rd of this year, if you have time to come. My pronouns are she and her. My visual description, I have brown hair, fairly long, right now in a ponytail. I wear glasses. I'm in my 50s. And I have a big smile on my face because I'm very happy to have this panel of great creatives and thinkers talking about Tobias Wong tonight. In my background, what you see is a close-up image of the Candy Shop, a project curated by Tobias Wong and José Lepage in 2009. It was a pop-up shop in Capellini's showroom in New York. And Lepage had commissioned candy artisans Papa Bubble to create candies inspired by furniture on display in the store. One of the central goals of the Tobias Wong Project was to create the conditions to ensure that his remarkable artistic contribution would be remembered and his work reinterpreted over time. And this virtual panel that's recorded contributes to this process. I just want to take this opportunity to thank the Tobias Wong estate for their support and for loaning us a majority of the works on display in the exhibition, and to Gordon Wong, Tobias Wong's brother, who helped document our project through a series of short documentaries. I also want to, it's very important to recognize the generous support of Canada Council for the Arts. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that MOV is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. The ancestral village of Sanok was located where the museum is now standing. And I was just thinking today, but it's ironic that we, faced with the climate crisis, are pushing for design practices that are regenerative, whereas Indigenous communities around the world have valued this approach all along. I'm very excited about tonight's program. I love that we have one presenter and one moderator in Vancouver and two presenters in New York, two cities that were very dear to Tobias Wong, who was born and raised in Vancouver and who moved to New York in the late 90s where he flourished artistically. And the presenters will share their thought on Tobias Wong's legacy, but also their perspective as design instructors responsible for training the next generations of designer. So I'm very excited about that. And I will now pass the mic to our moderator, Jenie Gao, whom we invited to moderate this panel with us because of her important work on the power of art and creativity to create more equitable relations and futures. So Jenie will introduce herself and then share with you the format and framing of this evening's panel. Merci, Jenie.
All right, thank you, Vivienne. Yeah, thank you for introducing this event, and I'm excited to see so many folks here. And yeah, hope you're ready for an enriching conversation tonight. So, hello, my name is Jenie Gao. My pronouns are she, they. I'm a second-generation Taiwanese and Chinese American. I have short black hair and a side-split pixie cut, and a side fade, and I have light olive skin. I'm a public artist, and I have been running an anti-gentrification business out of the arts since 2014, and I also currently live in Vancouver, where I am close to finishing my Master's of Fine Arts degree at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and I completed my BFA in the US at Washington University in St. Louis. I'll share a little bit about how I came to moderate this panel. I met Vivienne and Elisa and the Museum of Vancouver team last summer, and our first conversations were about equity in the arts and what it means to be doing equity work in the context of museums and the fine arts industry. And I was specifically drawn to being a part of this event because of how Tobias Wong's work is situated in relation to the fine arts industry. Wong's work plays with the tension between art and design. And he uses the strategies of design while also cultivating the aura of the fine art object. He pokes fun of the fine arts industry, and his work has a critical edge. And yet I would say that the objects themselves seem very much at home in a fine arts context. And so what you can glean from Wong's work is that while he's critiquing the fields of art and design, he doesn't actually want to work outside of these systems. He's very much working inside of these systems. And it is significant to be showing up with the irreverence and the disruptiveness of his work in a field that often has required people to accommodate how they behave in relation to that industry, and to show up as himself with all of that irreverence in the context of this industry. And so for myself, I just completed my thesis on artist labor, cultural power, and institutional accountability. So I'm excited about this conversation and what it means for BIPOC, for women, for queer people, for people who have historically been excluded from the field, to bring all of ourselves and bring our criticality to this field and ask questions of what it means for our work to affect institutional accountability for past harms, and also to create transformation in these spaces for the future. So with that, I'll give a brief introduction to the panelists. Leo Vicenti is joining us from Vancouver, where he is an assistant professor of communication design at Emily Carr University. And Rama Chorpash is joining us from New York, where he's an industrial designer and a university senator and a tenured associate professor of product design at Parsons at the New School. And Amanda Huynh is also joining us from New York, where she's an assistant professor of industrial design at Pratt Institute. So I'll go over a little bit of the format of the event. And so first we'll have a short presentation, a 5-minute presentation with 5 slides of artwork from each of our panelists. So they'll be able to give you a more fulsome introduction to each of them and what brings them to this conversation. From there, we will move into the Q&A section. We have some prepared questions that I'll be going over, and each of our panelists will be able to answer each of those. And please, at any time during this event, feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will be keeping track of those and asking those as a part of the discussion after the 5-minute presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into our presentations. Who wants to, I actually don't know who, if we picked somebody. Do we pick somebody
so
now?
we are going by alphabetical order and first name.
Right.
So Amanda
Great.
is first. I'm just going to share
All
the
right.
screen.
Wonderful.
Hi, everyone. As the slides are going out, this is Amanda speaking. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here in Lenape-Hoking. I'm in my mid-30s. I'm an East Asian woman of Chinese descent. I've got long black hair that's currently tied back, and I'm wearing a shirt dress that has a print that is marbled blues and grays, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf filled with books and houseplants at home. It is nighttime here in Brooklyn. Thanks everyone for being here. Okay, I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna speak fast. I went really far back in my Instagram archives. I mean, 2012, I don't even know when Instagram became a thing, but 2012, I posted the Happy Together set of watches that Tobias Wong designed. But my first encounter with Tobias Wong's work was when I was an undergrad studying industrial design at Emily Carr. It was a big, it made a big impact on me when I got to see the work in person at Inform, which was a big connection for us, for students to the outside design world in Gastown, but also just seeing that there was this East Asian designer with Vancouver roots who was now making this big impact in New York. You can see here that when I posted this was 549 weeks ago, which was actually the first time that this set of watches was on view at the Museum of Vancouver. And then very luckily, a friend of mine picked up the reissue for me recently. So now I finally have them. I could finally afford them. And they're just sitting on my bookshelf. So to the next slide, please, Lisa. myself, I'm trained in industrial design, but my own research and practice is really in food design. I deal in food. So using food as a design material has really allowed me to connect my industrial design training with broader systems and justice related issues. This is a project called One Lovely Hour, which I work on with Professor Rennie Lee at OCAD University in Toronto. Shout out also to my graduate assistant, Charlotte Ryder, who's helped a lot with the prototyping that we've done for this plate, which is designed for culturally appropriate food in long-term care. So older adults who are living with dementia, and thinking about culture and memory and food, but also dignity in this eating experience, and curating this One Lovely Hour. We had a pop-up during Toronto Design Festival in partnership with a chef named Eric Chong, and we took over the restaurant. He created menu items that really reflected exactly the constraints that also appear in long-term care homes. And we were able to have this wonderful dinner and conversation using plates that were produced locally. So that's just a snippet of food design. Onto the next slide, it is the Alto doorstop that Tobias made in 2003. The Savoy vase that it's made from, I just checked the MoMA pricing. It's $245 US in US dollars today. But in casting concrete into this glass vase, of course, there's no way that you're going to release it without actually breaking the vase. So it was interesting to think about the mold as an object and the value that's being transferred from the form of the mold to the positive, and then this kind of high-low of a vase being the object versus a doorstop, which we picture as just something that we kind of kick around. So the way that I describe food design in terms of material manipulation is the same way that traditional industrial designers think about like wood or plastic. It's a material that we can manipulate. We can use additive manufacturing, subtractive manufacturing, we can cast things, we can fabricate from a sheet material. So if you've baked a muffin in a tin, then you've cast a mold before. So this idea just popped in my brain to like make this, I don't know, milk jelly from a smaller Alto tray. One of the pluses of teaching in an art and design school is you have access to the shop. So I just get to make these like ideas that pop into my head. I made this last year and also ate it last year. this jelly that was in response to Tobias's work. The next thing I'm going to show is actually an example of how food design topics come into a class project. This is from some years ago, but I really thought it was a nice way of connecting the work of Tobias with another exhibition that's on in the Museum of Vancouver right now, or maybe it's over. It's coming to an end. The Seat at the Table exhibition. My students at Emily Carr were designing for Chinatown in this project, thinking about the disappearing cultural food assets, which were identified by the Hua Foundation as the barbecue meat shops, the greengrocers, the apothecaries, and the fishmongers. So these are still disappearing at an alarming rate. So for the students to come into this world of Chinatown, some of them never having been there or just being unfamiliar, and designing a takeout window concept for existing shops. So they're not taking over any shops, but kind of finding a window or a way in for new residents of Chinatown, and also still serving the community that's there. So we designed takeout windows as well as a takeout packaging concept. So they had a 1:8 scale of the actual window, and then a 1:1 scale, something you could hold in your hand. We ate a lot of food in class, but also it built the capacity to talk about something deeper. So cultural food assets, gentrification, parallel foodways, and histories of exclusion and racist policies in Chinatown through this idea of using food is sort of the way to sneak in the bigger topics. The last slide is like, I'm sure Elisa, when you looked at these, you're like, what is happening? The last slide is a project that I give to my students now, which is called Just Bulbs. In New York City, we have a shop, it's a store called Just Bulbs. Literally, they only sell bulbs, and it's been around for a long time. And there's also a store that used to be down the street called Just Shades. But some of my own favorite, most memorable projects from school are jokes that we just took too far. And I think that's why Tobias's work really resonated with me. I was like, I love everything that's happening here. It's just so joyful. And my students do this Just Bulbs project after a somewhat serious lighting project. It's a competition where they respond to a prompt of a theme. I give them a bulb, just they pick it out of a hat basically, and they respond to the bulb. And I let them do whatever they want. So then they get away from thinking what industrial design looks like, or what is like, I don't know, like Dutch minimalist design, all of these things that they kind of constrain themselves to. And then I get to see a lot more about their personalities and learn a lot more about them. That project was due. I was in labor that's the date this project was due this year, but I got to see some of their work anyway. So just pushing the boundaries of industrial design, I think also helps expand the canon beyond just like the white male industrial design history, thinking about whose aesthetics do we value and what do we recognize as design. The last thing that I'll say, I know there's some really great questions. So the last thing I'll say about Tobias's work is we're existing in this field of capitalism, being in the field of things, right? Industrial designers are thinking of things. I don't need more things, but I'm always acquiring more things just because they are so compelling to me. And it's always going to be a negotiation between what we make, what we want, and the assigned value and meaning of things. Thank you.
Thanks so much for getting us started, Amanda. My name is Leo Vicenti. I'm an enrolled member of the Hickory Apache Nation. I'm coming to you not from Vancouver, but actually from South Surrey, where I reside on the lands of the Semiahmoo and the Kwantlen. I'm male. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm wearing a gray sweater and light-rimmed glasses. I have long, dark brown hair that's tied into a braid. And I'm sitting in my guest room, in front of a bookshelf with various like things on there. I'm glad that everyone joined us today. I like that Amanda also, started with a similar image. And I think in comparison to our other panelists, like I'm not as familiar with Toby's work. And so I think it was interesting for me to get more acquainted with it. And it kind of brings me back to, I guess, my, trajectory into like academia. I chose to kind of do this comparative works where this isn't actually, my work, but you'll see some of that in a little bit. But I think this starting point of looking at Happy Together, which is by Toby, it really brought me back to, studying at the School of the Art Institute and learning more about artists and designers. The piece on the right is actually by Felix Gonzalez Torres, which is untitled, in parentheses, or in brackets, Perfect Lovers. And I think when I first saw this piece, it just really, took me back to that place, working with, I guess, like ready-mades and having a sensitivity to materiality, and being also to find routes of communication, and what are the ideas and concepts, or what are the themes that are behind this work. I really like these two pieces because they're both in some ways about relationships, right? And I think that those ideas and coming today also, like, spending time together, right, and valuing that time to actually reflect on his work. I think those are really things that just popped out to me and really got me excited for today. So and I'm not too sure if everyone's familiar with Felix Gonzalez Torres, but he was also an educator. So when I was, going into academia, I was really not only studying his work, but also his philosophies on pedagogy, right? And the critical aspects and his questioning of everything around him, and I really think that, in terms of like identity and where he's coming from, it really resonated with me as I was going into academia and being an educator. So yeah, I really love these two pieces, and I think it was just a great kind of start as we're getting the night started. Next slide, please. And yeah, I think I am coming from like an indigenous perspective, and so I think these aspects of like humor really like resonate not only with me, but also a lot of the communities that I represent and support as well. The one on the left being the Coke Spoon #1 by Toby, and also contrasting that with this vehicular dreamcatcher, which was produced in 2002 by Greg Deal. And I just think these two pieces are brilliant, and exploring that space of what are the possibilities, and how can you communicate, how can you push the limits and bring up ideas, right? So I thought these were kind of like similar things, and I think these are getting kind of closer into I guess an area where I enjoy like working myself. A thing about Greg Deal is that he worked in performance a lot, and as we'll discuss, I'm sure Rama's work too with Toby as well. Greg Deal's work was also collaborative with James Luna, who is a major performance artist of his time, and who recently passed away a few years ago. So I think it's interesting to also be creating work, but also the idea of collaboration, and then creating that dialogue, right? And I think those are really interesting points in all of this work. Next slide, please. The second iteration of the Coke Spoon, I think was just really interesting. I think in the catalog, this comes up and showing the actual cease and desist letter, which I think is just brilliant, and to show that as part of the piece. The work on the right is a work that I did in 2019 entitled Without Compromise. And this was actually work that I say like I'm doing collaboratively with James Luna. And the graphic that you can see on the bottle is actually taken from one of James Luna's sports jackets that he had embroidered on the back. But if you know about the image, this kind of like slumping over, I guess you would say like warrior silhouette, that's actually taken from sculpture that was developed by an artist who went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So as I was doing this work, and as these events had happened with James, I was also like bringing that work back to life in a lot of ways, and being able to collaborate with James, and just the way of going about it as a designer, working in both like art and design, but also working in gallery settings and working in corporate settings as well, right? Like Amanda had mentioned, designers, a lot of the times go into capitalism. So how do we deal with that, or how do we create things, knowing that that's the space that we're supposed to occupy? So I had a really fun piece and fun time being able to work with James in this particular setting. Next slide, please. The next piece that really touched to me, because I work a lot with language and typography, is this piece entitled Bullshit, which he did in the late 90s. And I think just the fact that, he's using these works that are already, so this is a stamp, and something that you would stamp on, a document, a business stamp or something, fairly like pervasive, right, in the office setting, but also the fact of customizing this and having it just readily available to mark on any type of document or any type of substrate that you can find. I find it just really interesting, and just kind of like calling out the time, right? Going back to the clockworks of what time are we living in, and being able to really critique that. And this work that I presented on the right was created in 2019, which is entitled Domestic Spirit Animal. it was kind of doing the same thing of just really like encapsulating the time. I was in Chicago at the time and just seeing these markup cards in delis all over Chicago. And so a lot of the things that were happening were, the selling of spirituality and selling like sage to burn, and also the spiritualism and spirit animal kind of like ideals. I just thought it was necessary for me to kind of like respond to that. It's also kind of like a big critique of what I think about that, I have my own spirituality, and I don't think that would be something that would fit into a capitalistic environment. And so in a lot of ways, this is rejecting those perspectives. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the other piece, I mean, because I think this resonated me too as well, just because of the timing. I think when Tobias had created this piece entitled "This Is a Lamp" in 2001, there was a lot of like just timing about how that had happened. I have a fine arts background, but I study in visual communication design. So I don't really feel myself confined to a specific like area. And I think that in a lot of ways I try and question and be critical of in the way I go about my making. But it reminded me of before and the work that I was doing before I even went to grad school. So this piece entitled "Spineless," which I created in 2014, it was actually a concept of a chair, and it was for a show that AIGA put on in Denver at the time. And so I got accepted as a 2D piece. But this kind of spineless chair was kind of the concept, reflecting on my situation as an indigenous person representing kind of a Moiti cultural situation, but being a designer as well, and not seeing value of design in the Southwest. It also features, if you look at the bottom, a small stereotypical caricature, which is common in my work, blowing smoke signals to communicate, where I thought the communication battle really was at that time for me. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see, that kind of archetype come up. Even I've never thought about making chairs, but I think there was something really, brilliant and fun about these pieces and how they came to. And I really like that in his work. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that's it. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Leo, thank you. So I'll introduce myself as he, him, his. My name is Rama Chorpash. I'm a tall white male, gray, sandy, blonde hair, and I'm in my home office on the North Shore of Staten Island, and I have wavy panels behind me that are a project I did a number of years ago for Victorinox Swiss Army. And as a designer, my work spans many domains. So it's interesting to hear Leo speak of capitalism. My first name is Love Rama Chorpash. Rama is my middle name. And I was raised in Northern California without electricity, with a lot of people trying to learn native languages and sort of trying to live a more sustainable world, which ended up being very unsustainable in the end, because they were so far removed from society. And so my rebellion was to become a designer, an industrial designer, and sort of dive into capitalism. And at a very, very young age, was pretty successful. And I met Toby in 2000, where I had just had my first show at the Museum of Modern Art with a collection for Herman Miller. And I had an opening on Wall Street, and literally my work opened the New York Stock Exchange with a huge billboard. But at the same time, I was haunted. I never changed my name. I travel with the name Love on my passport, and that was really with me. And Toby and I had a deep connection really quickly when we met each other. And I started to be invited to do projects in small art galleries and design spaces. And Toby and I would often exhibit together and do projects. And so we shared the space a little bit. And he really wanted to collaborate with me and do a project. And he had a lot of ideas and I had ideas. And around this time, I was invited to be a partner in a design office and realized that I had made it as a designer, but I wasn't happy. So I started to teach and pulled out of galleries because I also wasn't very fulfilled in that area, and really think about who I would be as a designer. And I decided to invite Toby to a critique. And the image on the right that you see is a kid sitting in an Eames high chair where they had the students, you can look it up online, it's called Eames Hack. It was done in 2007. There's a great body of work from a charrette that I put together. And the students had hacked Eames furniture. They did a fiberglass chair that was a toilet seat and really looked to this question of what were the desires of modernism and its failings. And I invited Toby as a guest critic to come to Philadelphia. And this outspoken person that I knew going to openings and hanging out with came to Philadelphia, and I had paid the stipend that I could afford and brought him there. And he was completely silent in the review and very shy and didn't want to talk. And the students were all excited to have their guest critic. And so I looked at Toby and said, well, what Toby would say if he were to speak. And I started to channel Toby, what Toby would say. And so it was and the work was extraordinary. I think, amazing because Toby's body of work was not so large, but the students knew who he was in, early 2000s. So he had, they were extremely excited. They said, Rama got Toby Wong to come, to Philadelphia. So this is a project that he did. And then afterwards, he was very talkative with the students and had a great time with them. And it really inspired that generation of students who had the opportunity to meet him. And then I won't go in depth, but later when I impersonated Tobias Wong, Toby later came to me and said, Rama, I'm going to be in this event. I've actually waited a long time to find someone who would understand my work. I don't like public speaking. And the way you speak about it is in some ways stronger than how I can speak about it. Will you interpret me and will you be Tobias Wong? You did a great job at the review. And I said, okay. And so I met him for maybe an hour over a coffee and didn't know all of his work that well. And he showed me a few images and I really just talked to him about who he was and how his process was. And it was very different than my own work. And I disagreed as a young designer a lot about how he thought about things. And then I presented him for an entire afternoon in conversation around design, wit, and the creative act. And it was my interpretation of him, completely ad hoc. All of the blogs say that we had rehearsed and there was a script, but in fact, the script was just a relationship. And so I see it as a complete collaboration of trust, where he trusted me and I trusted him. I don't normally get nervous about things. I stuttered as a child. I don't do well if I have to read something, but I was very nervous going up there on stage as a gay Taiwanese designer, which is how I had to put it forward. So that was a little bit. His work definitely, I was doing in many ways similar projects. We had learned about the same artist. My father's an artist. I had lived in Brazil for 4 years and worked with Silda Morales, who's a really extraordinary artist, and a lot of people that were very akin to Tobias's work. So I'm going to show a very small body of work, which is, I think, an homage to Toby and related to him as well, and our backgrounds together. On the left is another student project I wanted to share from a project I just did with the Royal Danish Academy. And the other faculty I was working with was Masashimi Kajita and Nikolai de Greer. And it's a project where we're looking at design in super aging societies. And the title of the project is called furniture for future selves, where we worked with the J46 chair, and students interpreted the chair in different ways for their aging selves. So they went home and met with their grandparents and talked about what would this work, this modernist stern work, look like should the designers still be alive that had designed it. And so there's a really incredible collection that the students did over last summer. And next image. And in the spirit of that, before this work was done, I did a project during COVID in my own studio where I was locked up, and I was working with reinterpreting Danish classics. I think different than Toby's work, where he's sort of the bad boy and provocational to sort of shake things up. My work's a lot subtler and productive in different ways. So this is the Arne Jacobsen ant chair for super aging society, which is a really unsteady chair. So I interpreted it as a walker. So the ant, the two holes in it become the ant's eyes, and you can slide the chair around in your apartment. Next image. This chair is a designer who emigrated to the United States, Jens Riesum. And this is from 1949, one of his seminal pieces, and it's was produced in I think it was in Cuba that it was made. He was really the beginning of Knoll as we know it as a furniture company. And the chair on the right, I did pieces also during COVID, when so many people were dying in convalescent homes, to create a doctor's cloth that would go over this vinyl upholstery. So these sort of makeshift designs, which I made with an augmented reality handheld CNC router, a lot like how Toby worked, where he would sort of put everything into it, sleeping on people's couches to be able to get the money together to buy a Tiffany lamp so he wouldn't have to pay rent, and borrowing money from all of his friends. So he could make these pieces that had a lot of impact. COVID for me was like that. So being sort of locked up and making things in the middle of that. Next image. And this is another chair from that object. I did a lot of chairs during this time. I did these in a couple of weeks, really. So, you know, like each one would take a few days to work on and prototype. And this is from, you know, this chair is also called the Kennedy chair. It's a really important piece. It's and it's the Hans Wagner wishbone chair, or CH24, also from 1949. Next image. So the piece that I added is this white apparatus, which one could lean back. I wanted to do a photo shoot with super aging people. And again, during COVID, I was alone, and I set the tripod up and actually realized I'm balding. I didn't realize that until I took the photograph, and I am designing for my future self. So part of the workshop that we worked on is each of us is thinking of the other and where in our connection to other people, but how we share this space. And you know, hearing the ceded land where the museum lies, and thinking about where I am on the North Shore, where I live in the oldest house on the hill in Staten Island, looking out on Manhattan, which was a weekend house of a very wealthy person. It's a 5-story house, which was on Lenape land, but it's now just completely falling apart because it's not desirable after the car was invented and people can go to the Hamptons, and it's on the periphery. But it's also, I guess, 6 houses down from Frank Alva Parsons' house, which is the school that I teach at, and the same commute that he would make coming into the city, which most people don't even realize that this place exists, and it's a forgotten place. So really, you know, I'm very interested in the deep connections of our work and our, you know, our connection to other people, and how do we imagine futures of other selves with our work, you know, how do we embrace that? So that's just a little bit of my work, and I'll pass it on to our moderator.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you to all three of you for creating those presentations. I really, really enjoyed, learning a bit more about each of your practices and your insight into this. So with that, we'll get into our questions. And the question I want to lead with is that all of you are educators. So as faculty teaching at the university level, what is it like working with the new generation of designers? And how are today's students and upcoming designers envisioning the world?
I don't know if we're like raising how we jump in, but I mean, I can just speak to this really briefly to kick us off. But I think the students are really hungry for more, but there's also so much information. There's so much technology. Of course, everyone is talking about AI and the impact on what we're doing. So it's a lot of things for them to corral and coming like into the future, right? So all these students now that are graduating this year from their undergrads were the first ones who were fully online for their first industrial design classes. So then the next generation is like the ones who were online for their art classes in high school, online for their art classes in middle school. So we're not going to see the end of the impact of virtual learning for a long time. So I think that's something that I don't really have an answer to, but it's important for them to see that their work can be impactful, that it could be something that is larger for themselves. And so I can write that into a design brief, but I also think that it's important for the students to find what's driving them beyond just form and like these kind of more abstract studies that we once did as industrial designers.
Yeah, I mean, I think just adding on to Amanda, I mean, I think we are in a time of change. I think with virtual learning and how that affected the whole world. I think as a faculty, I think it's exciting. I think having kind of like additional like tools and being able to expand on how we work and how we're able to kind of engage with students as well. I mean, it definitely made things more flexible. And yeah, I mean, it kind of diversified, education in a lot of ways, but there's also like challenges that come along with that too. I think we've run into our own challenges of, working on Zoom. But I think for students, I mean, it's from my perspective, it's been, positive to come together as a community, to see who your classmates are, right? See your instructor, to be in person. I think those are great things that we can say that we value now, opposed to jumping on Zoom meetings and being able to look at other black boxes, right? Like I think we all know that challenging environment. But I see a lot of promise for these next classes and cohorts coming up, and I think it is really exciting. We do still have like challenges facing practice and academia, but I think everyone is really ready for that. I think there is a general curiosity about like Amanda had said, like AI and how that affects our practice. As for me as a communication designer, AI has already been part of Photoshop for some time. So how do we then like deal with that? How do we work with that? And yeah, it's just an example of some of those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm seeing, and again, my experience is very post-COVID. I mean, it's incredible how different it is after COVID. And for me, what's really different, I think, is I feel like the students are closer to their true selves, like they're doing what they want to do in a way and revealing things. They're more vulnerable in what they're doing. But the big shift that I've seen is really that the boundaries between analog and digital for them and the generation that they're coming from is very different than in the past. Like that used to be a larger discussion, but they see the world as digital. Like that there's not a sort of this question of man and nature or are we natural. They see themselves as digital beings in a different way. And that, you know, these are very stereotypical things. Not, of course, not everyone sees themselves that way, but I'm finding a lot of students working that way, and a lot of them, where in the past as a designer, I would encourage them to work in an iterative way where they're coming up and prototyping and working towards something. I think the students in many ways are working more like craftspeople, and that they're able to digitize and make things that are artifacts, and they make them in real time, where and it's a double-edged sword. So they can complete things much quicker, their ideas, but there's not this sort of planning, or also the presenting a prototype as an idea. So there's I think a lot of shifts that are happening, at least in my classes this year.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing those insights. I'd building off of that, one of the things that I appreciated in all of your presentations was how you interwove your own work with your own response to Tobias Wong's work, whether you knew him personally or whether you learned of his work later on. And in some way you all brought up how he was critical and provocative in the work. And given what you've just shared about the students as well, and then coming into this with this mindset shift and being more vulnerable, and also having different expectations of education, what do you see as the role of critique in the industries of design and contemporary art?
I can get us started. Well, I think you know, it's really important, and I think yeah, I just think it's kind of like an exercise, right? In like seeing, and I think being able to see those elements, and being able to be critical, and think of, you know, multiple ways about going about things. I think this can be said in terms of like art and design, but also, you know, we've brought up capitalism too, or we can also critique like government, right? And so I think the way that we think about society and betterment, improving society, I think you know, really just being critical of it. I mean, like if we don't see it, we can't, you know, improve it. And us as creators and designers, you know, we have that ability to create. And I think it's very important to actually be able to critique it before even the creation even happens. Because without being able to critique it and identify the shortfalls, you know, we're not really meeting you know, what our desire, what our goal is in that project. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge role of critiquing, and not just confining it to, you know, design and art, but, you know, looking at industry, looking at government, and I think it's very important. And I think you know, it was great to see that in Toby's work, and I think all of us are also, you know, practitioners of that, of being very critical in how we create and how we work with our practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think to, you know, to build on that, I mean, a challenge, I think that Toby didn't have in the same way that it is now, and I would be very interested to see how he would respond to this today, is the sort of thumbs up world that we live in, that it's, you know, it's all about the likes. And that's what I find with the students, is they're not necessarily looking for a thumbs up, but they're looking for a path of agreement. It's about, and it's, and if we look towards like social justice and consensus, but it's about this micro consensus where you're finding your space, and designers can find a voice in what they're doing, but they're not necessarily confronting big questions, because it's harder to see the sort of hegemonic power structures that are there, because it's not kind of them and us. So I think that that's a very challenging moment. Like Toby was on sort of the end of design critique, where people were writing about design and doing critical design in a way. And I think the work that's critical is art, falls into art. And to do work that is generative through design, I think is very exciting. And I think there's a lot of people doing it. But I think from a student perspective, having, gone through a school system and then going to a university, it's hard to catalyze that in them. So I think that's a challenge, where in the past, it was a hunger that students had when I was teaching. Now I have to like pull up older work and talk to them about the context they're living in and show them examples from different periods of time to get them to speak up. And so, but I would say that people students, and I'm teaching at the New School, which I think is the most international school in the United States. The students are speaking much more openly than they did in the past. Like, during the last election cycle, we ran a project where we had sort of get out the vote. And it's just a simple logical design project, and students go into subways and they make things. And I was surprised to see that there were groups of students who came and said, I don't believe in voting. Where I'm coming from in my country, we have experts. Why would you have a citizen vote? Which this I never heard before from a student, and and this is really exciting to hear this, that you can have that conversation. But it completely changed my teaching to think, oh, there's really like big fundamental differences culturally between people, and sort of as a professor, one finds that they treat it's a blanket statement, but that's certainly not the case.
Yeah, I think thinking about criticality in design, I graduated from Emily Carr in 2009. Yeah, that's right. I was like in 2009. And we at that time didn't quite have, at least in our department, like the way that we were working in Vancouver, didn't quite have that established language for speculative design. And I remember sometimes we fought our professors like tooth and nail on a lot of projects that we started to do as a direct result of influences like Tobias Wong, when we were trying to be critical in our work and still making things, making tangible things. But the first questions that we would always get in critique from our professors was, who is the market here? How does this sell? How do you make 10,000, 100,000 of these? Whereas today we can, hopefully be a little bit more curious in the question asking about what it is that you're actually trying to say in the work. How does your work make these issues more tangible, right? Because I think so much of our power as industrial designers or creative cultural producers is that we make things tangible. We're putting things out in the world that are real, and so because people can interact with them, then we have something to talk about rather than all of these like abstract ideas that we might just have. We can manifest them tangibly.
Yeah, I think the power of Toby's work is I think he was trying to work as a designer. Like he in talking with him, he wanted to work with a lessee. Not on a museum project, but actually working with the tooling and working with a lessee to change and shape society. And that it really questions, what is the role of an artist? What's the role of a designer? What's the agency that they have? So I think I think that discourse is ongoing. We certainly have that discourse in Parsons between faculty, even still talking about projects like, what is a speculative project? When do projects actually affect change? And when, what's the difference between talking about something or being something?
Yeah. A lot of places we can go with that. I'm just letting that simmer a little bit. Let's also talk about humor. Is humor important? And if so, what do you think humor does in the context of contemporary art and design? And who is it for?
I can start us off again. I think that humor is like really important. I think even going back to the slides that I shared, in like looking at Greg Deal's work, I think that that's a very humorous piece, and I think I really equate it to, you know, a lot of like indigenous communities, and just having that like essence, having that you know, outlook on life. I think it's important, and I think there's, you know, the indigenous experience is very tragic, and so there's a lot of trauma, and so I think having humor and you know, having to deal with those challenges historically that work into like the contemporary, right? There's a lot of historical trauma that seeps into like society nowadays, that's still, you know, residual, and I think I think that humor is really important, and I think that's, you know, some of the work that even I've done is, you know, based off of that. You know, I think um, domestic spirit animal, like I mentioned, or even without compromise, like those are serious pieces, but they're also like humorous pieces, you know. And I think regardless of the context of where they're at, you know, whether it's a supermarket or a liquor store or, you know, an art gallery or something designed, I think that ability to, you know, laugh, that ability to find like optimism in a space, even though you know, I think if we're thinking about who it's for, I mean, like me entering an art space is, I'm definitely not supposed to be there, right? Like, and I don't see a lot of indigenous designers too as well, you know, and so we're kind of like in an other position, and so I think to think who it's for, and if it, you know, if I am speaking to my communities versus, you know, speaking to you know, gallery goers or something like that, like I think it makes it very interesting, right? And I think it is, you know, going back to some of the themes we talked about, disruptive, you know, and I think it's important to disrupt those spaces and to think about like who's, you know, who should be in the gallery spaces or who should be in a museum, right? And making it contemporary versus like something antiquated. So yeah, I mean, I think those are all interesting like things to talk about.
Just so Leo, I was really moved by your poster, the domestic spirit animals, and from a design perspective, have you worked looking you're speaking of capitalism with actual commerce and thinking about not in terms of sale of poster, but in terms of like transactional space and what, you know, how to reframe transactions?
Yeah, I think a lot of the iterations for a lot of my graduate work was entering that space. Uh, you know, what does that look like, and what does the classroom look like, right? I think those are some of the things that I thought were really interesting, but also just, you know, relationships. And I think yeah, I mean, I studied a lot about like vernacular art environments, and so you know, I'm not confined to traditional like art and gallery spaces. I mean, I consider, you know, my home as a gallery too, as well, or just as well as the land can be a gallery. So I think that brings up like interesting things to think about how, you know, we're presenting our work or contextualizing our work, and like you're saying, transactions. You know, if that is the context, like what is the work then, and how does that change? So I think those are interesting places to explore.
Yeah, for me, humor in this context really is about like shifting an existential threat to a conversation. And what I think humor can be such a dangerous tool, because it can, you know, like, who are you laughing at? And so I think what I enjoy so much about a lot of Toby's work is it's so open-ended that it allows there's like a grace period that's there where you can sort of work through, you know, things through. So I mean, actually, I don't know if people are familiar with the crystal candlestick that Toby did, and I had a client who I was designing a product that she sold it on QVC, and it was a huge success, and she saw Toby's crystal candlestick and said this would be a great QVC product. And it's incredible how the joke in the work is actually the reality of the work. And I really don't think Toby was laughing at, he really was laughing with society. And I think that for me, humor is best when we can not laugh at people, but laugh at the shared space that we have and have empathy for others and say, how do we fix this together? And so I feel that humor is a very effective tool in that, but also it's one of the cruelest tools that one could have. I mean, that's how that a witty person is, can be a bully. So
in terms of being like humor in the context of contemporary art and design, I think it lowers barriers to access. It's kind of what I love about designing with and around food, is you don't have to feel like an expert before talking about it. So when work is like very self-serious, or it seems like maybe it's serious, we don't ask the same questions maybe, or we're like kind of fearful to be like, what if someone judges me by not knowing enough about this? So I think if we're laughing at something, then we can start to question, why is this funny? And like Leo was saying, humor is a method of coping as well. It's this moment of reprieve that you have, and that's what a lot of Tobias's work provides. Like there's like so much seriousness in design, especially during that era. There's a lot of famous designers, or like kind of rock star designers, them by name, and then it's like reflecting on their work and like making something funny. With that Just Bulbs project that my students do, it's not always so campy. I just chose some of the like funny more remarkable ones, but you do something campy and goofy, and then suddenly it's an expression of joy, and then how you can think about how you can start to bring that joy back into your work that is less about me just pushing them to do something totally outside of what they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I really appreciated all of your answers to that, and particularly the breadth that you covered, from lowering barriers to access. I love thinking about humor as a way to lower barriers to access, and Leo, to how you talked about it as a way to cope for a community that needs healing, and that power that humor can have, that you spoke to, Rama, like both for the capacity of cruelty, but also for the capacity of laughing with one another and building community. So that was really, that was a really rich answer, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So I want to take us a little bit back to what we kind of addressed when we were talking about critique. We've covered in different ways how Tobias could be irreverent and disruptive, and how he often riffed on the work of other artists and pokes fun at what the art world consumes, and elevate that to a status of high value, while also talking about how the work is seductive and very much a part of these institutional structures that he responds to. And examples like the crystal candle, where the joke is actually the reality, and that this object is both humorous and also something to be desired. And so what I would be curious about is, what would you say to upcoming designers today who want to challenge the field of design, while also operating within the field as it is?
I just want to go back to the mentioning of Felix Gonzalez Torres as an educator. And one of his quotes is that he instructs his students to question everything, and I think that was just really so memorable for me as an educator, to just, like you're saying, to challenge the field of design and operate it well, knowing that those aren't like concrete avenues, right? Like we can think about, for example, indigenous approaches to design, right? And in a lot of ways we can think about that as going about it different ways. And I think, yeah, it just, you know, having, you know, we talked about criticality, but also like, you know, challenging how things are done, and questioning the field as well as outside of the field, right? And I don't think, just from what I mentioned earlier, like not needing to play by the rules. I think those are interesting things that you know, we learn the rules, but we also break the rules. And I think giving students that, empowering students to be able to do that, and giving them the tools and techniques to go about that is really important, in terms of, like, you know, education.
The way that I sometimes phrase it to students about challenging the field of design, is they're thinking about industrial design as this industrial designer as this job, that is like has a set job description. But actually, I think that any of the students that we're having today are going to hopefully be writing their own job descriptions, like finding their own, like creating their own jobs, because there's so many things that we don't know that they can do yet, but with the same skills that we're equipped with in like criticality and thinking about materiality, and again, just making things real and tangible. So I think the way that they'll be operating within the design field is actually just like broadening them in the boundaries of what is recognized as the design field. So thinking about, okay, here's like what I want to do. How do I start flexing that into design? And it's, you know, like to bring it back to food design, just as a like concrete example for me, is like that this is a newly recognized field, but of course people have been doing it for a long time. So it's just the way that you're able to keep redefining the role of the designer in what you're doing, just by what interests you, and you are doing it as a designer. So then that's, you know, should be recognized as the new field, or like part of the field of design.
Yeah, there's a, I mean, the famous saying from Tibor Kalman is them equals us. And I think, you know, the work he did in the 80s of how do we look at companies and brands and what people are doing as equal, that they you know, Silda Morales calls it circuits of ideological, what is it? It's insertions into ideological circuits, I think was his term in the 1970s, that the systems that are there are actually neutral when they reach scale, and they can carry many different messages. And so I think really looking at, you know, Coca-Cola being asked to carry HIV medicine in the 90s, and them in Botswana in their refrigerated trucks, and Coca-Cola saying, you know, we're a soda company, we're not going to do that. And then people protesting, and then Coke saying, sure, we'll provide medicine and drugs throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and that's our new mission. And to look at the work that we're doing, and how can we leapfrog and use the systems that exist, because these systems are who we are, and we're not separate from them. And, you know, again, I talked in the beginning that I, you know, grew up without electricity until I was a young teenager, and tried to live outside of this world with other people living in the forest. And where I grew up is burning with forest fires, because you can't escape. Like, you know, you have global warming, and I haven't gone back there in years, but we're surrounded on all sides because we're all together. So I think what I try to encourage students to do is to not look at the world that they're living in as other than them, that they're, you know, that they need to, I was taught as a young designer that you have a secret agenda, and you try to insert that agenda into your work, and you try to make a living doing it, when in fact, you know, the answer is not to have a secret agenda, and talk really openly, and to say, what is your agenda? My agenda is this. Where do we share agendas? Am I willing to sustain your agenda, which is different than mine? Why do you have that agenda? And have, you know, that discussion, which is a painful discussion to learn to compromise. But that's what I encourage students to do, is to find that space in between.
Yeah, the thing that I think of is that, especially for all of us who are working in the context of complicated and often complicit arts institutions, is that going off the grid, going outside of the system does not excuse us from social responsibility, nor does it necessarily shield us from the harms that have happened and are continuing to happen. And so in some way, we have to find a way to participate in order to be a part of the changes that we want to see happen. So I'm paying attention to the time. We do have 2 more prepared questions that I do believe we have time to ask. I'd also love to get to audience questions. So for anyone who has a question they haven't typed in yet, this would be a great time to go ahead and put a question in the chat. I do see we have 1 question from Alan. So we'll get to that shortly. So I'll ask my next question, and please, for anybody who has questions, it's a great time to type it in the chat. So I want to know, how do you each personally think design can be used as a tool for social change? And you can speak to that in terms of how you incorporate that into your own work, or how you see your students incorporating it into theirs.
I think I can speak to some of what you were saying earlier, Jenny, about design being this, it can be this really seductive thing, or like really compelling, really remarkable. And because we're able to make these things, you know, quote unquote real, I think that's how it's so powerful as a tool of social change, because we can make these different proposals. Like in that Chinatown project that my students did, that they presented that to the City of Vancouver Planning Department, and they actually live in the City of Vancouver Planning Department now, because they worked outside of the boundaries that the planning department has to work in. And so that when they presented to them, they were like, oh, we hadn't thought about this, because all we think about is like people asking about more frontage on the streets or whatever. And it's within this, they're having to work within their own system, and so don't get to propose things like this. But for the students to make the models that then now live in City Hall, as a reminder to them that there can be other ways of thinking about space, of people, of communities. So I think that's really powerful, and it's been a big impact on the students. They come tell me, it's been how many years since that project? 5 or 6 years, and the students still say that they still go to Chinatown, they still visit a lot of these places, and like think about the work and proposal that they've done. So sometimes it's about sneaking in, you know, the social justice or justice oriented points of a project by writing the design briefs towards it, but sometimes it's just about helping the students start, because there's so many issues that you can easily be weighted down. You know, you can like lie in bed and read the news all day, and then you'll never get up. So I think rather than being so weighed down by the weight of the world's issues that you're paralyzed, it can just be about encouraging them to start doing something, making proofs of concepts that they can put out there and start answering questions through the work that they're doing. And that is an iterative process.
Yeah, for me, it's about how do I approach the work that I'm doing as a paradox, that I don't know the answer. I'm not trying to solve a problem. Like as I work, I'm creating new problems, and to try to acknowledge the dichotomous things that are unearthed in a project, and to stay optimistic about it, and to try to move forward with it, knowing that what I create and put into the world is a prototype. And I would love to write an apology for it after it's done, when it goes out, because I see it and it doesn't work, and I accept that. And so, you know, I think as designers, we need to be more forgiving of ourselves, but also to look to what we are creating, and also what we expect of our students, and to help them to understand that they're just part of a relationship, and that, you know, design is a human right that everyone does. We have a lot of knowledge and experience in the area, and can help other people and to do it, but that it's a very complex relationship. And so I think, you know, for me, and that's in my image of what design has, my image has changed a lot over time, because in the past I was working towards that sort of archetype of what it is. And thinking, relating this back to Toby, one of my tensions with him discussing, what is design is, he actually was very sure in his prototypes, or he seemed to be very sure. I don't know if he really was. I wasn't his therapist, but he would talk about his planning and his execution. And when he made it, he would do it at the highest level because this is where it would stop. And that was sort of the end of it. And so I think one of the tragedies of having lost him is not seeing how he would have changed, because that's where we saw him at that time. And that's forever Tobias Wong. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in both like art and design like spaces and other spaces, I think my like presence as a practitioner is helping to change, society, contributing to society, and having, like I said, indigenous perspectives and indigenous ways about going about things in my my thoughts and thinking. I think that in a lot of ways I'm contributing to society and helping change it in a lot of good ways. Whether it's the work that I'm doing as an educator, I also practice as an exhibition designer, and I'm also a type designer. So in all of those instances, I'm able to put forward my thoughts and the products that I create, and I don't really like a lot of design, I guess, like school thinking of like, there's I don't really adopt like a problem space. But I hope to create things that are beautiful, whether they're, might be more tragic or humorous, but I really, strive to make things that, I find beautiful, and that, either me or my communities or other people can relate to. And I'm hoping that, like in being able to see and, having a look into how I work and the things that I make and my practice, I'm hoping that it influences the students that I work with, and that I'm able to, engage with in an academic or educational environment. And hopefully it influences them, and it adds to, the capabilities, hopefully, that they can take into their own practice, and not necessarily saying that you need to be an artist or you need to be a designer, but how do you make things? What do you want to make? And not giving any constraints to that, but seeing, sometimes there is hybrid spaces, and like me, I mentioned earlier, like I don't play by the rules. So if I want to do something, I'll do it. And I think that I hope a lot of the students can take that same approach of, like, I'm not trying to put you in a box. Like, I just want you to make things. Like, what do you want to make? And I think that's the exciting part of it, because they bring their whole background into coming into academia, and it's a big jump. It's a big risk. And so I just really want to foster, that growth for them. And I think those are all really exciting. I think the indigenous perspectives, practice, and how that influences the student in such a time of growth. I think those are all in a lot of ways, like I guess I think of this as like preparing like the new generation, right, to go into battle of sorts in the contemporary time. So I think that's all really exciting to me.
Thank you for pointing that out, Leo, just that your presence can be the change, right? In my entire undergrad and graduate design education, there was not a person of color that taught me, or that's, stood at the front of the room and had that power. But thinking now about designers and ourselves as educators, as facilitators, more than anything, bridging all these gaps as we in the things that we teach. I think you just put it really wonderfully, to be able to be yourself and like really model that for the students so that they can bring fully their own perspectives. And then the way that we teach aesthetics at Pratt, it used to be that is the only way that you can evaluate aesthetics, right? This is like the highest aesthetic skill that you can have, but now we can comfortably say that it is one way of evaluating aesthetics, and whenever you're bringing in from different cultures, like that is just going to enrich your experience. It's going to enrich your perspective in what we're teaching.
Yeah, I mean, a question that I often find myself asking students that I didn't used to ask is, how do I judge this? and I used to be the arbitrator, and now I don't know, all I can do is get them to talk and try to connect them, which is really exciting to actually really not know, but to see, oneself as having experience and being a visitor to their studio. And even the notion for me of the teacher of having this knowledge that I'm going to pass on has shifted a lot, and that's very exciting. The time we're living in, that we can do that, and for me, it also makes the university at its best a really sacred space. It's a space that you don't have to go to learn. You can learn the things without being there, but it can be a place to come together to share a community of thought together. And so, I know for myself as a designer, I used to design so many things, and to just work on 2 to 3 things now that have some kind of meaning to me is much better. So, and I think it's difficult to do more than that for anyone.
Yeah. I'm going to move us to audience questions. So we've got a few. The first one is directly for Rama. If the others have something to share as well, happy to hear. But actually no. This one I think only Rama can answer. Rama, did Tobias have any comments about your version of Tobias Wong?
But it's he certainly did, and he had comments afterwards as well. I'll share. I shared this with Vivian when we first met, and it's not directly from Tobias, but it was a colleague that was there, Stephen Heller, who was one of our panelists, and Toby was seated at dinner right next to me with my wife, because he wore my name tag and I wore his, and we were having dinner, and the panelist asked me, I don't understand, were you adopted by a Taiwanese family? Or like, how did you come to be Tobias Wong? And I said, I'm not Toby, this is Toby. And Toby and I talked about that moment, and Stephen stayed a little bit and then quietly excused himself from the table and didn't come back. And I think at the moment he might have felt duped, that he had been tricked. And, I think what Toby's intention was that design and ideas are not a person. It's a way of looking at things. And his using of other people's work wasn't that he was appropriating people's work, but the work was his, just as it's yours. And and each of our work together is a shared thing. And so I think that's, if he said anything to me, it was that trust. And I think to have that trust to allow someone else to do that is a big deal. And I think that all of us should channel each other a little bit more. So I think, yes, he did share with me that it worked, if you will. But I think the message was something about a connection that we have to each other. So I was not impersonating Tobias Wong. We were sharing that space, just as all of you can share it, just as we're sharing tonight.
Yeah, and so this second question, it builds on something that you brought up earlier, Rama, but I think any of you would be able to answer it. And it's about with the rates of everything going up in price, let's say materials, artist materials going up in price, are artists still working like Toby, or because of digital designs, are people mainly mocking up the ideas, or are artists going back and making physical things?
I'll pass that to Amanda.
Yeah, I think for me, it's so important to me to make the physical things, and I feel like I have to push the students more and more because the technology has come so far since I was a student, and the things that they're able to approximate in the digital space is incredible, like digital drawings, the way that they can render things now. But it's just not the same as being able to hold something and evaluate it in your hands, right? So this is something that I keep having to push in all these different ways, because students will model something and say, okay, here's the finished one. I'm just going to press print and 3D print it. But then it comes back, and of course, there are all these questions of like, how does it fit in the context? Questions that they could have answered many prototypes ago if they just started using like cardboard to make it, rather than just guessing in digital space. So I think it's some tension that's happening, but I think we will be going back to making things physical. I also believe a lot in tangible interfaces as well. So this is something that I've started to teach, just because I think there's now this big question of, do we even need physical design? Everything should just be like the on-screen UI UX is known as product design. It's kind of like taken over another title for industrial design. So for the students, they're like, how do we get a job? Because now all the product design jobs are on screen. But I think there's going to be a coming back of wanting to have more physical feedback for the way that we're interacting with the world. If you think about just a simple dial for a volume rather than touching a screen, which is what we do for everything else. So moving beyond that, this like plain audio visual of how we consume a lot of our day, to actually bringing in the touch more, and the tangible spaces more. So yeah, I think there will be, if they aren't already going back, but there will be in the future more going back to making things physical, because these mock-ups are just not enough to be as powerful as we need them to be, and all of the things that we've just talked about.
I mean, I'm going to add something to what Amanda's saying, and it's a critical concern, and that's that the notion that the digital is in place to create an analog representation of something so we can understand the physical better is also shifting quickly. So if one looks at the metaverse, Peter Sim, one of my students, we were having a conversation, and he was sharing this notion with me of the metaverse as learning how we relate to things in space, and then its ultimate goal is to retrain us to look at things in the metaverse, because if we can learn things in the metaverse differently than in the universe that we're living in outside of the metaverse, then it's a competition with the physical. And so the idea that one is, you choose one and one represents, they actually can become different worlds. So I think that people more and more are living in a digital space. I have 2 children, and I look at the kids around me, and so this is something that is a very interesting moment in our time of, what is made. At the same time, you can make things so easily, really, by pressing a button, and trees are cut down, and recycling streams, and material streams, and labor, and robots, and it has never been easier to make something. So people are making things very quickly, but we can't always see what the implications are. So
Yeah, I think, just reinforcing what Amanda had said. Like we do teach like in first year a design core course where you touch on communication design and interaction design and industrial design. So those are very much like part of a collective curriculum. So I think just reinforcing that is part of what's taught at Emily Carr, and kind of what we expect, I guess, like going forward for students. And I think nowadays you can't just have one, you need to have kind of all of them, right? Like we have to both explore those spaces and know how to operate and put together all of those elements including like other ones, right? Like being able to exhibit in a gallery, right? Being able to create 4D deliverables that support the work. So I think those are, I mean, like kind of the requirements of operating as a creative today. But going back to the question, I think, I mean, like sometimes it's not as easy, especially when looking at Toby's work, where some of the materials that he was working with, you know, they do have a hefty like price tag. And I think that's kind of like been a barrier in some of my own work, where I can't afford to buy things, or I can't afford to have things produced. So I think I'm very capable and I can design things. It might just not be the financial barriers might be something that's actually part of the reality of it too as well. So I think digital as being able to envision those ideas and those concepts. But yeah, I hope, and I really encourage students today to be able to work in 3D spaces and being able to fabricate and especially coming from a communication design background or a visual communication background, not being able to just stay in 2 dimensions, but also be able to operate and work in 3 dimensions and 4 dimensions as well. And I think that's what I really hope to have as bare minimum competency for students today. So I think that's one of my hopes as an educator.
Yeah, that's great. We are just a little over time. I'm going to read one comment in the chat that got a lot of updates. So I love how that humorous sharing challenges the logic under which capitalism works. Yes, your comment is very popular. So that's Rita's comment in the chat. Thanks for sharing that. And really quickly, one closing question. What does the phrase designing change mean to you?
Am I going first? I can go first.
Go first.
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, like being a player in the game. Like I have a whole like background, I have a whole closet of things that I bring with me. And so a lot of the work that I do, it really comments on and addresses my lived experience and my heritage. And I think that, I hope that I'm able to contribute to society, positively in that way, but also, hoping to change it. I think we did a land acknowledgement today, like I think there's a lot of the work that I'm doing like follows along those same lines of, how does that become realized in text, right? How do we make visible those communities that we're not seeing right now. So I think designing change for me is just being here, like I said, and being a player in the game, being able to contribute to the space, and hoping that it's a positive change as well, as there's changes that are negative as well. So I think I want to be a positive influence in the world.
I can just pick up on that. I think the phrase designing change, it makes me think about mapping the systems in order to know what's out there. This has been like a first generation student skill of mine, is to go into, I didn't know like what undergrad was. I didn't know what industrial design was. It kind of found me. It wasn't something that I knew was a viable career path, right? So it's mapping systems in order to know what's out there so that you can start to be a part of it and then start working inside and around it. But designing change now has to come from this perspective of almost like a radical optimism. You can't just do business as usual and forge ahead as we are, but we can choose to do the best that we we can with what we have, and understanding that it might, you know, like Rama was saying, putting something out in the world and then writing an apology letter, that's like, yeah, let's just be really open to the things that we do. Could possibly be outdated really soon. Like the language changes. I'm having to, like, you know, with our students who are so much further ahead than we are, but language changes, and so also form language and all of the things that we do will also change, and it just means it's a marker of the time. But all we can do is be optimistic and do our best.
Yeah, it's a powerful question, because it's almost the prompt is almost that we should change, and that we're designing change. And I think the question Leo brought up, that change is not necessarily good, and it's, you know, it's a really salient one. And I think for me, designing change is you know, as Amanda is saying, to always go back and reassess what's there, and to be open to what it is. And it might mean that there's no change, and sometimes it means radical change and radical repositioning of what one is doing. But to allow yourself to do that is, and to accept that, you know, maybe you don't need all of these things, or maybe you do need to change it, but to be open that it's not the same pathway, that you have to sort of look at options continuously, and to look at what's there. And sometimes it's bringing back something that was, because that's what is. And, you know, there's the you know, the quote that we build worlds upon worlds, and that the worlds don't go away, and the change is not building on top of the next world, but the other world is still there. And so, you know, sometimes knowing, is the change progressive, or is it actually, is it an exploration into the foundation? So for me, that's designing change.
Well, thank you, all of you, for your generous answers to the questions. I know that I've benefited and learned a lot tonight, and I hope our guests feel a little richer and wiser for this experience as well. So thank you, everyone, for staying on 2 minutes past the event, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having us and sharing your evening with us.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you.